Who were the mountain men? If you lived in America in the early 1800s and you told people you were heading west to live in the mountains all by yourself, they'd probably look at you like you'd lost your mind. The West back then wasn't highways, motels, and fast food stops. It was wild country, endless forests, snow-capped peaks, rivers that could swallow you whole, and animals that didn't exactly want to be your neighbors. But some people did just that. They wandered into the wilderness and decided to make a life out there. These were the mountain men, rugged, scruffy, independent to a fault, and sometimes more comfortable around grizzly bears than other people. Think of them as the original outdoorsmen, the kind of folks who could survive with just a hatchet, a rifle, and maybe a frying pan if they were feeling fancy. So, who were they exactly? Well, the term mountain men usually refers to fur trappers and explorers who roamed the Rocky Mountains during the early 19th century, roughly between 1800 and the 1840s. They weren't one single group with uniforms or matching jackets. They were a mixed bunch: white settlers, French-Canadian voyageurs, Native Americans, and even a few runaway sailors or restless farmers who decided, no, regular life isn't for me. What tied them all together was a taste for freedom, adventure, and in many cases, money. Because let's be real, mountain men weren't wandering into the wild just for fun. They were there for furs, especially beaver pelts. Back in the day, fashionable folks in Europe were obsessed with beaver hats. Don't ask me why, it was just the look. Kind of like how people today buy sneakers for way too much money, except instead of waiting in line at a store, you had to trek through grizzly country and set traps in icy rivers. The fur trade was booming, and mountain men were the workforce that supplied it. Picture a guy trudging through knee-deep snow, rifle slung over his shoulder, carrying heavy traps and bundles of fur. His clothes were stitched from animal hides. His beard was basically its own ecosystem. Bathing wasn't exactly a top priority. Mountain men smelled like smoke, sweat, and whatever animal fat they'd been cooking with that week. In short, these guys were tough. But being a mountain man wasn't just about trapping beavers. It was about survival. They had to build shelters, hunt their own food, fend off wolves, and figure out how to stay alive when winters dropped to below freezing 4 months. If you've ever struggled to put together an IKEA shelf, just imagine trying to build a whole cabin with nothing but hand tools. And unlike IKEA, there wasn't a customer support line to call when you messed up the roof. Mountain men weren't totally isolated, though. They traded with Native American tribes and often adopted native techniques for living in the wilderness. They learned which plants were safe to eat, how to tan hides, and even how to craft snowshoes or canoes. Some married into tribes, blending cultures in ways that kept them alive and made life a little less lonely. In fact, without native knowledge, many mountain men probably wouldn't have lasted a single winter. And while they spent a lot of time alone, once a year, there was something called the rendezvous, a massive gathering where trappers, traders, and native peoples met up. Think of it as Coachella, but instead of music and flower crowns, you got whiskey, trading posts, and a lot of questionable storytelling. Mountain men would swap furs for supplies, catch up on news from the outside world, and maybe party a little too hard before heading back into the mountains. Despite their rough lifestyles, mountain men became legends. Stories spread about their adventures fighting bears with knives, surviving blizzards, and carving paths through unknown terrain. Some of it was true, some of it was exaggerated, and some of it was just flat out invented. But over time, the image of the mountain man became larger than life. They were seen as symbols of courage, independence, and America's restless push westward. Of course, reality was less glamorous. Life expectancy wasn't great. Accidents, diseases, and animal attacks were common. If you cut your hand badly or broke a bone, you were in serious trouble. And the fur trade itself had a shelf life. By the mid-1800s, fashion changed, beaver populations declined, and railroads started opening up the West to settlers. The golden age of mountain men faded. leaving behind just a handful of cabins, journals, and legends. But for a few decades, these rugged characters helped shape the image of the American frontier. They proved that a person could walk into the wilderness with nothing and build a life. They carved trails, mapped rivers, and created the first cabins in remote valleys. In short, they showed what grit, stubbornness, and a lot of luck could accomplish. So when we talk about mountain men building cabins from scratch, we're not just talking about carpentry. We're talking about survival, creativity, and the human need to make a home even in the harshest environments. Their cabins weren't mansions. Most were single-room log huts with dirt floors and smoke-stained ceilings, but they represented safety. They meant, I belong here, I made it, and that's where our story begins. In the chapters ahead, we'll step into their worn leather boots and see what it really took to clear a patch of forest, cut logs, stack them into walls, and put a roof over your head before winter came calling. Spoiler: it wasn't easy, but it was possible, and the mountain men, for all their rough edges, managed to pull it off, sometimes with style, sometimes with stubbornness, but always with survival in mind. So, tuck yourself in, because this isn't just about chopping wood and hammering nails. It's about a way of life that was equal parts dangerous, lonely, and strangely inspiring. The mountain men may not have smelled great, but their story, that's worth sticking around for. Heading west, imagine packing up everything you own into one backpack and saying, "See ya," to your family, your friends, and probably your barber, because you won't see him again. That's basically what heading west looked like for mountain men in the early 1800s. Back then, the West wasn't just another part of the map. It was a giant question mark. There were no highways, no gas stations, and definitely no Google Maps to warn you about traffic on the way to the Rockies. The wilderness stretched on 4 miles, and most people thought only fools or very brave men would try living there. The mountain men happened to be both. So why did they go? Well, like we talked about in chapter 1, money was a big reason. Beaver pelts were worth their weight in gold. Well, not literally, but close enough. Fancy folks in Europe wanted their hats, and trappers were the suppliers. If you could snag enough beaver skins, you could trade them for supplies, food, or even some hard-to-get luxuries like coffee or gunpowder. That made the risk of heading west tempting. But it wasn't just about money. Some guys were chasing adventure. They were bored with farm life, tired of towns, or just wired differently. A field to plow every day didn't excite them, but the thought of climbing mountains and wrestling with Mother Nature, that sounded fun. Others were running away from something, debts, the law, or maybe just nosy neighbors. The wilderness was good at keeping secrets. When a man decided to head west, he had to be smart about what to pack. Picture a shopping list that included things like a rifle, powder and bullets, an axe, a knife, traps, blankets, flint for fire, and maybe a kettle or frying pan. If he had a horse or mule, that was great. If not, he had to carry everything himself. Food was usually limited to dried meat or flour to make flatbread. No snacks, no chocolate bars, no instant noodles, just the basics to get started. Leaving civilization behind meant saying goodbye to comforts. No taverns, no beds, no shops. Once you crossed the Mississippi River, you were basically on your own. A mountain man's first journey west was a mix of excitement and terror. Imagine walking into an endless forest, knowing that every step took you farther from safety and closer to the unknown. The trees seemed bigger, the nights darker, and the sounds of wolves or coyotes made you rethink your choices. And the terrain, brutal. Rivers had to be crossed, sometimes with water so cold it could numb your legs in seconds. Mountains had to be climbed, trails hacked through thickets, and storms endured with nothing but a blanket for cover. Horses could break legs, supplies could get soaked, and if your rifle broke, well, you were in deep trouble. But there was also beauty. Heading west meant seeing things most people back east couldn't even imagine. Wide open plains that stretched forever, snow-capped peaks glowing in the sunset, herds of bison thundering across the grass. For men who craved freedom, this was paradise. Every mile west was a mile farther away from rules, taxes, and anyone telling you how to live your life. Still, you couldn't just wander aimlessly. Picking the right route mattered. The trails carved by Native Americans or earlier traders were lifelines, guiding mountain men toward rivers, valleys, and passes through the mountains. Sometimes they followed waterways, since rivers offered both fish and a path through the wilderness. Other times they traveled in small groups for safety. Solo journeys were possible but dangerous. If something went wrong, you couldn't exactly call for backup. Once you got deep enough into the wilderness, the real work started. You had to scout for a place to settle somewhere with water, plenty of game, and, most importantly, trees for building. If you messed this part up and picked a bad spot, winter would punish you fast. Some mountain men didn't make it through their first year because they underestimated how brutal the wilderness could be. On the way, you'd meet all sorts of challenges: swollen rivers that swept away supplies, steep cliffs that tired out both man and mule, and weather that flipped from scorching hot to freezing cold in the same week. And don't forget the wildlife. Grizzly bears weren't exactly thrilled about new neighbors, and wolves were always watching. A mountain man needed quick reflexes and sharper instincts than the animals around him. But for all the danger, the journey west gave these men something precious: freedom. No one was watching the clock. No one cared how long your beard was, and no one told you what to do. You made your own choices, carved your own path, and relied only on yourself and the land. That sense of independence was addictive. Once you had it, going back to normal life seemed impossible. Some mountain men kept journals, and their notes reveal a mix of hardship and awe. They wrote about waking up to frost on their blankets, hunting deer to keep from starving, and stumbling on valleys so beautiful they felt like paradise. They also wrote about loneliness, the kind that eats at you after weeks without human contact. Heading west wasn't just a physical journey, it was a mental test. Could you handle silence? Could you face danger without backup? Could you keep going when every bone in your body told you to turn back? For those who made it, the westward journey was the first step toward building a new life. It wasn't easy, but once they found a spot to settle, the real adventure began, turning wilderness into home. That meant clearing trees, cutting logs, and building cabins from scratch, something we'll dive into soon. But before the cabins, before the comfort of a fireplace or a roof, there was the long, uncertain road into the mountains. Heading west was a gamble. Some lost, some turned back, but the ones who stayed, who dug in their heels and kept going, became the mountain men we still talk about today. So next time playing about traffic on your commute, just remember, these guys walked through blizzards with packs on their backs and wolves at their heels, and they still thought it was worth it. First steps in a new land, so you've made it. After weeks of trudging through rivers, mountains, mud, and probably some serious regrets, you've finally arrived in the wild country where you plan to live. Congratulations, you're officially in the middle of nowhere. There are no towns, no inns, no friendly neighbors with sugar to borrow. Just trees, rocks, and the sound of wind whistling through the valleys. This is where the mountain man's real test begins. Surviving the journey was tough, but settling in was even tougher. You couldn't just flop down on a log and call it a day. The wilderness was not about to roll out a welcome mat. Every decision mattered because a wrong choice could mean freezing, starving, or worse. The first task was simple in theory: find the right spot to live. In practice, it was like speed dating with Mother Nature. Too close to a river, flood risk. Too far from water, you'll die of thirst. Too high up on a mountain, snow and wind will wreck your cabin. Too low in a valley, cold air sinks, and you'll be shivering all winter. So what did mountain men look for? Water was at the top of the list. A steady creek or spring nearby was a must, not only for drinking, but also for cooking, washing, and keeping traps baited. Next was wood. You needed trees, and lots of them, not just for building a cabin, but also for firewood. One winter in the Rockies could chew through a mountain of logs, and nobody wanted to be caught short when the snow started falling. Game was another big factor. You wanted to be near deer, elk, and other critters that could fill your belly. If the land looked barren, you kept moving. After all, you couldn't live on wishful thinking. Sometimes mountain men followed animal trails to find good spots. If the deer liked a valley, chances were it would be good for humans, too. Safety mattered as well. A clearing was nice because you didn't have to chop down quite as many trees, but you also didn't want to stand out like a target. Predators prowled the woods, and an exposed cabin would invite unwanted guests, not just bears and wolves, but also other people. The wilderness was vast, but not empty. Native tribes lived there, and depending on the tribe, a lone trapper might be seen as a guest, a nuisance, or an intruder. Picking a spot meant balancing opportunity with caution. Once a location was chosen, the real work began, making camp. Before you even thought about a cabin, you needed shelter for the night. The simplest option was a lean-to, just a few poles leaned against a tree and covered with branches, bark, or animal hides. Not exactly cozy, but enough to keep the wind off. If you had a canvas or blanket, you could rig up a tent. Fire was the next priority. A good blaze meant warmth, cooking, and keeping predators away. Without fire, you were basically dinner waiting to happen. With camp set up, the mountain man would start exploring. He had to get the lay of the land, where the water flowed, where game trails ran, where the best trees grew. It was like scouting out the neighborhood, except instead of coffee shops and grocery stores, you were rating rivers and oak groves. And if you found bear tracks, well, that was your neighbor. This stage was all about observation. Mountain men were experts at reading signs. They could tell which way the wind usually blew by looking at how the trees bent. They could guess the soil's richness by what plants grew there. They could even read the seasons in the stars and the angle of the sun. Living out here wasn't just muscle, it was a constant mental game of noticing details that city folk would miss completely. Food was a daily concern. Until you had a cabin and supplies stored away, you were living meal to meal. That might mean fishing in streams, setting traps for rabbits, or going after bigger game if flock was on your side. Sometimes, it just meant chewing on dried meat you'd carried from the east. A bad hunting stretch could leave a man weak and discouraged fast. And then there was the loneliness. Imagine standing on a ridge, looking out at miles of untouched wilderness, realizing there's not a soul around 4 days. No voices, no wagons, no church bells, nothing. Just silence and the occasional call of a raven. For some men, that silence was freedom. For others, it gnawed at them until they started talking to themselves or worse, answering back. But loneliness had its flip side, too. It gave mountain men a deep connection with the land. They noticed the rhythm of nature, when certain flowers bloomed, when the rivers swelled with snowmelt, when the herds migrated. Over time, they weren't just visitors in the wilderness. They became part of it. Of course, none of this was possible without help from the knowledge of native peoples. Many mountain men learned survival skills directly from tribes, which plants were edible, how to build stronger shelters, and how to track animals more effectively. Some even adopted native styles of clothing and gear, because guess what? Buckskin was way better at handling rain and snow than wool pants from back east. The first steps in a new land were about more than just staying alive. They were about building a foundation. Once a mountain man had picked his spot, set up a camp, and learned the lay of the land, he was ready for the next stage, building something permanent. A place to hang his hat if he still had one. And that's where cabins come into play. You couldn't just wander forever with a blanket and a lean-to. Winter demanded walls, a roof, and a fire that wouldn't blow out every time the wind howled. For mountain men, building a cabin wasn't just a project. It was a declaration. I'm here to stay. But before the first log was cut, before the first notch was carved, a man had to take those first cautious steps, choosing the right place, learning its secrets, and deciding he was ready to gamble his future on one patch of wilderness. Some failed, some thrived, but all of them left footprints that told the story of human stubbornness in the face of nature's indifference. So, if you ever find yourself standing in the woods, lost and wondering if you should set up camp or just cry for help. Think of the mountain men. They didn't have GPS. They didn't have backup plans, just grit, an axe, and the willingness to try. And somehow, against all odds, they made the first steps into a new land and turned it into home. Tools of the trade, you can be as tough as a grizzly bear and as brave as a knight. But if you walk into the wilderness empty-handed, you're basically just bare food with strong opinions. That's why tools were everything to a mountain man. They didn't have a Home Depot around the corner, so whatever they carried on their back or strapped to a horse was what they had to work with for months, maybe years. So what exactly was in a mountain man's toolbox? Well, let's start with the most obvious, the axe. This wasn't just for chopping firewood. An axe meant cabins, rafts, canoes, and sometimes even self-defense if things got desperate. A good axe was practically an extension of a mountain man's arm. Without it, you weren't building much more than a sad little pile of sticks. Right up there with the axe was the knife, and not the kind you use to butter toast. We're talking big, heavy blades, hunting knives, skinning knives, and the famous bowie knife for the more stylish types. A knife was the ultimate multi-tool. You could use it to skin animals, carve wood, fix traps, slice food, and, in a pinch, wave it around dramatically to scare off things you really hoped never to fight. Then came the rifle. If the axe was for shelter, and the knife was for daily chores, the rifle was for dinner. Without it, you'd be eating a lot of roots and berries, and mountain men weren't exactly known for their salad diets. Rifles were long, heavy, and slow to reload compared to modern guns, but they got the job done. A single shot could mean the difference between a warm stew and an empty stomach. Powder horns, lead balls, and patches had to be carried carefully, because running out of ammo wasn't just inconvenient, it was life-threatening. Another must-have was the trap. Beaver pelts were the whole reason many mountain men were out there, so steel traps were their bread and butter. Heavy, awkward to carry, and sometimes dangerous if you weren't careful. Traps were still worth the hassle. A successful trapline meant income, trade, and survival through the winter. Of course, you needed something to cook with. A kettle or frying pan might not sound glamorous, but try roasting a rabbit without one, and you'll see why they mattered. Some men even carried tin cups for coffee because yes, even in the middle of nowhere, you still needed your caffeine fix. Coffee was worth its weight in gold, and boiling it in a battered little pot was often the highlight of a mountain man's day. Let's not forget about fire-making gear. Matches weren't common yet, so most men carried flint and steel. Starting a fire in the rain or snow wasn't easy, and if your gear got wet, you were in trouble. Many trappers guarded their tinder boxes like treasure. Fire meant life, plain and simple. Then there were the little tools people forget about, awls for sewing, needles and thread for repairing clothes, and small hatchets for light work. A mountain man's clothing usually needed constant patching, especially since buckskin shirts and leggings wore out quickly in the rough terrain. A man who couldn't mend his clothes would end up cold and miserable fast. Pack animals also counted as tools in their own way. A good mule or horse could haul gear, carry extra pelts, and, if worst came to worst, provide dinner. Not a pleasant thought, but in the wilderness, practicality always came first. Now, here is the thing, carrying too much was just as bad as carrying too little. Every pound mattered when you were climbing mountains or crossing rivers. Mountain men had to balance between being prepared and being weighed down like a traveling junk shop. That's why many learned to improvise. Break your axe handle, carve a new one, lose your pot in the river, heat rocks in the fire, and drop them into a hide-lined pit to boil water. No duct tape, no hardware store, just creativity and stubbornness. And sometimes, their tools weren't tools at all but skills. Knowing how to read tracks, how to sharpen a blade, or how to cut logs, so they locked together like puzzle pieces. These were just as valuable as any piece of iron. Tools rusted, broke, or got lost, but knowledge stuck with you. Interestingly, a lot of mountain men borrowed gear ideas from native tribes. Snowshoes, for example, were game changers in winter. Try trudging through waist-deep snow without them, and you'll feel like you're stuck in quicksand. Moccasins, too, were far better suited to the terrain than stiff boots from back east. A smart mountain man wasn't too proud to copy what worked. Now, let's talk about luxuries, the little extras that made life bearable. Tobacco was high on the list. Many mountain men chewed or smoked it, trading pelts to keep their supply stocked. Whiskey was another, though carrying it long distances was tricky unless you wanted to waste precious pack space. Some even hauled along books or journals, scribbling down their adventures by firelight. Those writings are the reason we know so much about their daily lives today. But in the end, the most important tool wasn't the axe, the knife, or the rifle. It was the mountain man's mindset. You could hand the best gear in the world to someone from the city, and they'd probably still end up crying by the first cold night. A mountain man's real edge came from grit, patience, and the ability to make do with whatever he had. So when we imagine them building cabins from scratch, it wasn't just swinging axes and hammering logs. It was years of practice, clever thinking, and constant care for the few precious tools they carried. A broken blade or lost trap wasn't just annoying, it could change the course of a whole season. Think about that next time you get annoyed when your phone charger breaks. At least you're not 200 miles from the nearest town with winter closing in. In the chapters ahead, we'll see how these tools, the axe, the knife, the rifle, the traps, and the knowledge behind them turned wild forests into homes. But for now, remember this, the mountain men weren't superheroes. They were just regular folks with the right gear, the right skills, and a stubborn streak a mile wide. And somehow, that was enough to build lives in the middle of the wilderness, laying the foundation so you've picked your spot, you've got water nearby, enough trees to keep you busy chopping for years, and hopefully not too many grizzly bears wandering through your backyard. Now comes the big step, building something solid. No more sleeping under a leaky lean-to or curling up by the fire like a dog. It's time to lay the foundation for your cabin. Now, before you picture blueprints, measuring tapes, and cement trucks, let's set the record straight. Mountain men weren't working with construction companies. There were no tool belts filled with shiny gadgets or power saws buzzing away. The foundation was as simple as dirt, logs, rocks, and sweat. But done right, it was the difference between a sturdy home and waking up under a pile of collapsed timber. The first task was clearing the land. That meant chopping down trees, pulling up brush, and leveling the ground. Easier said than done. Swinging an axe 4 hours takes a toll on the arms, shoulders, and back, especially if you've already been living off rabbit stew and creek water. Some mountain men were known to work until their hands bled, then wrap them in rags and keep going, because winter wasn't going to politely wait while you rested. Once the ground was cleared, it was time to think about the actual base of the cabin. There were a couple of methods, depending on the spot and how much energy you had left. One option was laying down large stones at the corners and along the walls. This kept the first logs off the damp ground, which helped prevent rotting. Another method was digging shallow trenches and setting logs directly into the earth. Not as durable, but quicker, and sometimes quick was the only option. And then came the logs themselves. Choosing the right trees was an art. You didn't just hack down whatever stood closest. You wanted straight, solid logs, pine, spruce, or fir if you were in the Rockies. Trees that were too small would leave you with flimsy walls too big, and you'd collapse trying to drag them into place. Ideally, you wanted logs about a foot in diameter and long enough to form the cabin's walls, without too many awkward gaps. Cutting the trees was only half the battle. You then had to strip off the branches, trim the bark, and drag those heavy beasts back to your building site. No chainsaws, no tractors, no forklifts, just brute strength. Maybe a mule if you were lucky. Imagine hauling a telephone pole by hand through uneven ground. Now imagine doing that over and over again, until you had enough logs to build a whole house. It's no wonder mountain men were built like human bulldozers. Once the logs were in place, you had to set the first layer, the foundation logs. These were the most important because they determined how square and level your cabin would be. If you started crooked, you were doomed. Some men used a simple method of measuring with rope or pacing off steps. Others just eyeballed it and hoped for the best. Let's just say not every cabin ended up looking picture perfect. To make the logs fit together, mountain men cut notches at the ends. The most common was the saddle notch, where one log sat snugly on the next, kind of like puzzle pieces. This locked the walls together and kept them from sliding apart. A poorly cut notch, however, meant gaps, drafts, and maybe even walls collapsing in the middle of the night. No pressure. Once the first logs were notched and set, you had the beginnings of a cabin outline. 4 corners, a square or rectangle, and the promise of walls to come. At this stage, it didn't look like much more like a giant Lincoln log set scattered in the dirt. But to a tired mountain man, those first logs meant progress. They meant the dream of having 4 walls and a roof was actually within reach. Of course, building wasn't a one-man job, if you could help it. Whenever possible, mountain men worked in pairs or small groups. Hauling logs, lifting them, and setting them in place was back-breaking labor. Alone, it could be nearly impossible. That's why many cabins were community efforts built by neighbors, trading labor like currency. I'll help you raise your walls if you help me notch mine. Out in the wilderness, teamwork was as valuable as any tool. The foundation stage also came with decisions about size. Do you go big and risk running out of time before winter, or go small and risk going stir-crazy in a one-room shack? Most men chose practicality. Cabins were usually modest, just 1 room, maybe 12 by 16 feet. Enough for a bed, a table, a fireplace, and the little elbow room. Forget about open concept layouts or guest bedrooms. This was survival, not interior design. And then there was the floor. Some cabins had dirt floors, plain and simple. You tamped it down, swept it out now and then, and called it good. Others laid flat stones or split logs to create something sturdier. Either way, you weren't walking barefoot in comfort. Every step reminded you that nature was still right under your feet. By the end of this stage, you had something that resembled the bones of a home. It wasn't cozy yet, and it certainly wasn't safe from the elements, but it was a start. A patch of cleared land, logs squared up, and the promise of walls rising soon. For a mountain man, that foundation wasn't just wood and stone, it was hope. Proof that all the miles of trudging west, all the nights under leaky shelters, and all the bare encounters were worth it. Of course, there was still a mountain of work ahead. Stacking the walls, building a roof, sealing the cracks, it was only just beginning. But the foundation was a milestone. It meant you'd claimed a little corner of the wilderness and said, "This is mine. I'm staying." And maybe, just maybe, it also meant you could finally get a decent night's sleep without worrying about a tree branch falling on your head. Stacking the walls so you've cleared your patch of land, cut down enough trees to make a beaver weep, and laid out the first logs for your cabin. Congratulations, you've got a foundation. Now comes the part that separates the dreamers from the doers, stacking the walls. If you've ever played with Lincoln logs as a kid, you already know the concept. The difference is, these logs weigh a couple £100 each, and if you drop one on your foot, you're going to have a very bad day. Building walls out of raw timber wasn't something you rushed. It was a careful, sweaty, and sometimes dangerous process. The basic method was simple. Cut notches in the ends of the logs, so they locked together at the corners, then stack them higher and higher until you had walls. But simple doesn't mean easy. Cutting those notches took skill. The most common was the saddle notch, where the bottom of one log was carved into a rounded dip so it fit snugly over the one below. This kept the walls from slipping and gave the cabin strength. Other times, mountain men used the V-notch or the dovetail notch, each with its own pros and cons. Whatever the style, the goal was the same. Get those logs to sit tight, with as few gaps as possible. Because gaps were the enemy. Even a small crack between logs could let in freezing air, rain, or worse, mosquitoes. And if you've ever tried to sleep in a cabin buzzing with mosquitoes, you know it's not exactly restful. So mountain men worked hard to get their notches right. A sloppy job could mean a drafty cabin, or worse, walls that leaned like a drunken sailor. Getting the logs into place was a team effort. One man couldn't just hoist a 20-foot log by himself, not unless he was part bear. Usually, you'd roll the logs on poles, lever them up with other logs, or, if you had friends, lift together. It was slow, grunting work, but with every log stacked, the cabin started to take shape. There's something satisfying about watching walls rise. Each layer made the place look less like a messy lumber pile and more like a real home. First the logs came up to your knees, then your waist, then your shoulders. Before long, you were standing inside 4 walls, looking around at a room that was going to be your shelter through rain, snow, and however many years you stuck around. Of course, mountain men weren't exactly architects. Not every cabin was straight and square. Some leaned a little, some sagged, and some looked like they were built by someone with one eye closed. But out in the wilderness, the goal wasn't beauty, it was survival. A cabin didn't need to impress visitors. It just needed to keep you dry, warm, and hopefully still standing in the morning. As the walls rose, there was another problem to deal with: chinking. No matter how carefully you notched and stacked the logs, there were always gaps. And gaps meant drafts. So trappers and settlers filled the spaces with whatever they had on hand: mud, clay, moss, straw, even animal dung. Not glamorous, but effective. Once stuffed in, the mixture hardened and sealed the cabin from the wind. Some mountain men even used a mix of clay and ashes for a sturdier seal. You might wrinkle your nose at the idea, but when it's 20 below outside, you'll thank every handful of moss crammed between those logs. Another challenge was deciding how tall to make the walls. Most cabins weren't towering structures. -1 feet high was about the limit for most single-room cabins. That gave enough space for a decent roof slope and maybe a loft area for sleeping or storage. Anything taller, and you were risking collapse or just giving yourself way too much work. Windows were rare at this stage. Glass was expensive and fragile, and you weren't hauling sheets of it through the Rockies. Most mountain men either skipped windows altogether or left small openings covered with hides or greased paper. Not exactly double pane efficiency, but it let in a little light without freezing you solid. A single doorway was usually cut into the wall later, once the structure was stable. For now, you climbed over the logs to get in and out. Not convenient, but better than the whole thing caving in because you rushed to cut a door too early. Every log added meant more sweat, more sore muscles, and more calloused hands. But it also meant progress. You could see your future taking shape in front of you, rough, uneven, maybe leaning a little, but yours. And in the middle of the wilderness, that was everything. It's worth remembering, too, that cabins weren't always solo projects. If you had neighbors or even just other mountain men passing through, they often pitched in. There was a spirit of "you help me, I help you" in the wilderness. Alone, stacking logs could take weeks. With help, you could raise walls in days. And when it was your turn to lend a hand, you showed up. Because out here, community was survival. By the time the walls were chest high, you could almost feel the cabin protecting you already. The forest might still loom outside, but inside those walls was your space, your dirt floor, your future fireplace, your little patch of safety in a world that didn't care whether you lived or froze. But don't relax just yet. Walls are only half the battle. Without a roof, your cabin is basically a wooden box that collects rain and snow. And trust me, no one wants to wake up with a puddle in their bed because they never got around to finishing the top. That's the next big step: finding a way to cover your new home so it can actually keep you dry. For now, though, stacking the walls was a milestone. It turned a patch of cleared land into something recognizable. It gave shape to a dream. Each log was more than just wood. It was a statement. I belong here. I can build here. I can survive here. Not bad for a bunch of trees, an axe, and one very determined human being. Roof over your head, so you've got walls. Congratulations, you're officially past the sleeping under a tarp like a wet burrito stage. But before you pat yourself on the back, there's one very obvious problem. Those walls are wide open at the top. Without a roof, you're still at the mercy of every rainstorm, snowflake, and nosy raccoon that comes along. Building a roof in the wilderness wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Walls could block wind and keep out critters, but without a solid cover, you'd still wake up soaked and shivering. The roof was the finishing touch that turned a pile of logs into something that actually resembled a home. The first step was deciding on the style. Mountain men didn't have a catalogue of options, no gabled roofs, no fancy shingles, but they did know the basics. A flat roof was faster to build, but terrible in snowy regions, because the snow piled up until the roof caved in. A pitched roof angled like a triangle took more effort, but let snow and rain slide right off. Since most mountain men lived in places where winter storms were no joke, pitched roofs were the go-to choice. That meant more logs. You needed beams to stretch across the top of the walls, strong enough to hold the weight of everything you were about to pile on. These were called roof beams, or purlins if you want to sound fancy, though most mountain men probably just called them those heavy logs we have to lift up there. Raising these beams was one of the most back-breaking tasks of the whole cabin project. Imagine trying to hoist a massive log overhead without a crane or a ladder, just grit, teamwork, and a lot of grunting. Once the main beams were in place, smaller poles were laid across them to form the skeleton of the roof. This created a framework that could hold the covering material. And here is where mountain men had to get creative, because there were no Home Depots in the wilderness selling asphalt shingles. The most common covering was split logs, called shakes or shingles, made by carefully splitting timber into thin, flat pieces. These were laid in overlapping rows, kind of like wooden scales, to shed water down the roof. Making them was time-consuming, but they lasted and provided decent insulation. If splitting wood wasn't an option, men turned to whatever the land offered: bark peeled from big trees, bundles of grass or reeds, even sod. Sod roofs were surprisingly common. You'd lay down a base of poles, cover them with bark or branches, then pile on chunks of grass and dirt cut straight from the ground. Heavy, yes, but incredibly effective at keeping the weather out. Plus, in the spring, your roof might even sprout flowers or weeds. Instant wilderness landscaping. The downside: leaks. No matter how well you layered it, chances were you'd still end up with drips inside whenever it rained. That's why every mountain man got used to moving his bedroll away from the wet spot. Another option was bark. Birch bark, in particular, was like nature's waterproof tarp. Large sheets could be stripped off trees and laid in layers across the roof. The problem was it didn't last forever. It peeled, cracked, and blew away in storms. Still, it could buy you enough time until you had the tools or patience to make proper wooden shingles. Whatever material you used, the roof had to be secure. A poorly built roof could collapse under snow, or worse, blow off entirely during a storm. Picture it. One minute you're enjoying a quiet evening by the fire. The next you're staring at the stars because your roof just took flight like a giant wooden kite. That's why mountain men tied, pegged, or weighed down their roofing material with rocks and extra logs. Of course, there was one more problem to solve: smoke. Every cabin needed a fire inside for warmth and cooking, but trapping that smoke under a roof was basically begging to choke yourself out. So mountain men had to leave a vent, a gap at the top, or a hole cut in one side where the smoke could escape. Later, some cabins even had rough stone chimneys, but in the early days, a simple smoke hole did the job. Sure, it let in a draft, but at least you didn't wake up coughing like you'd swallowed a campfire. Roofs weren't built in a day. It often took weeks to gather enough material, cut shingles, and secure everything into place. During that time, the cabin might sit half-finished, with walls standing tall, but the interior still open to the sky. It was a race against the seasons. If snow came early, you were in big trouble. Some men settled for temporary roofs of bark or hides, just to make it through the first winter, upgrading later when time allowed. But when the roof finally went on, it was a huge milestone. At last, you could sit inside your cabin during a rainstorm and stay dry. You could fall asleep without worrying about snow piling on your blankets. You could actually call the structure a house, not just a glorified log box. And that first night under a roof must have felt incredible. Picture a mountain man on his rough bed, listening to the patter of rain on the shingles, knowing he was safe and dry. Outside, the wilderness roared wind in the trees, wolves howling in the distance, but inside, the fire crackled, the walls stood firm, and the roof held steady. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he could rest without one eye open. Of course, the work wasn't done. The cabin still needed a proper door, a fireplace, and all the finishing touches that turned it into a livable home. But with the roof in place, the mountain man had crossed the hardest hurdle. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building a life. So yes, stacking walls was important, but the roof, that was the crown of the cabin, the final shield between man and the wild. And in the end, it wasn't just about keeping the rain out, it was about finally, truly, having a place to call home. Doors, windows, and fireplaces. A cabin with 4 walls and a roof is technically a house, but without doors, windows, and a fireplace, it's basically a wooden box. Cozy, sure, but not exactly practical. Imagine climbing over logs every time you wanted to go inside, or sitting in total darkness with no fire to warm you. That's when mountain men turned their attention to the finishing touches that made a cabin truly livable. First up, the door. Sounds simple, right? Just cut a hole and slap some wood across it. But doors were more than decoration. They kept out the cold, the rain, and, most importantly, anything with teeth. Bears weren't exactly polite. They didn't knock before coming in, so a sturdy door could be the difference between a warm night's sleep and waking up to a grizzly sniffing your stepot. To build one, mountain men carved out a doorway in the log wall. This was tricky business. Cut too big, and you weakened the whole wall. Cut too small, and you had to duck every time you went in or out, smacking your head on the way. The door itself was usually just a handful of planks, split and nailed, or more often, pegged together. Hinges weren't bought at the store, they were made from rawhide, leather straps, or clever wooden pegs that let the door swing. Some doors were so heavy, they didn't swing at all, they just lifted or dragged open like the lid of a treasure chest. And locks, forget it. The best you could do was a wooden latch bar dropped across the inside. If something wanted him badly enough, say, a wolf or a hungry bear, that latch wasn't going to stop it. But it kept out the wind and wandering raccoons, and that was good enough. Now, windows, or, more accurately, a hole in the wall that sort of lets in light. Glass was a luxury out on the frontier, and most mountain men couldn't dream of affording it. Instead, windows were often small square openings covered with oiled paper, stretched animal hide, or wooden shutters. These let in a bit of light during the day, but they weren't exactly clear. Imagine living behind a greasy lampshade, and you'll get the picture. Still, a little murky daylight was better than sitting in a cave-like darkness all the time. Windows were usually tiny, just enough to see out or shoot out of if trouble came knocking. Big windows let in drafts, which meant freezing nights, so cabins often had just 1 or 2 small openings. Think of it as natural insulation, or maybe just primitive energy efficiency. Then came the heart of the cabin, the fireplace. Without it, you might as well keep living outside, because staying warm in a log cabin without fire was impossible. Fireplaces also meant cooking, drying clothes, and even a bit of light after dark. Building one, though, was no small task. If stone was available, mountain men stacked rocks into a simple chimney at one end of the cabin. Mortar was often just mud mixed with clay, smeared between stones to hold them in place. It wasn't elegant, but it worked most of the time. If stones weren't handy, they built chimneys out of sticks plastered with mud. These worked surprisingly well until the inside caught fire, which, as you can imagine, was less than ideal. Inside, the fireplace took up a big chunk of wall space. It had to be large enough to hold a roaring fire, but not so big it weakened the cabin. A rough stone hearth helped keep sparks from landing on the wooden floor or the bed. Sparks were a constant hazard, so mountain men often slept with one eye on the fire and the other on their roof beams, ready to put out trouble with a bucket of water or sand. Cooking over that fireplace was a skill in itself. There were no stovetops, no ovens with knobs, meat roasted on spits, stews bubbled in iron pots hung over the flames, and bread baked on flat stones, buried in the coals. If you didn't pay attention, your supper could go from edible to charcoal in minutes. Still, after a day of hauling logs and chopping wood, even burnt stew tasted like a feast. The fireplace also doubled as the cabin's central heating system. With a good blaze going, the inside stayed bearably warm, even when snow piled up outside. Without one, frostbite would have been inevitable. Mountain men sometimes built sleeping platforms near the fire so they could soak up the warmth at night. If the fire went out, the cold crept in fast, turning your log cabin into a wooden freezer. With doors, windows, and a fireplace in place, the cabin finally became a real home. You could step inside, close the door against the wind, let in a little light, and warm yourself by the fire. Sure, the windows were murky, the door squeaked, and the fireplace smoked half the time, but after weeks of backbreaking work, it felt like a palace. Of course, finishing touches varied from man to man. Some cabins had shelves carved into the log walls, pegs for hanging tools, or rough benches for sitting. Others were bare bones, with nothing more than a bed of pine boughs and a pot over the fire. Luxury was a sliding scale out there in the mountains, and if you had a roof that didn't leak too badly, you were doing pretty well. At this point, the cabin was ready for its owner to move in. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a shelter built with his own two hands. A place where he could rest, cook, and dream about better days. Out in the wild, where every tree loomed like a challenge, and every howl in the night reminded you of danger, having four walls, a door, and a warm fire was priceless. So yes, the cabin might have been rough, but to a mountain man, it was more than just wood and stone. It was proof that he'd tamed a little corner of the wilderness. It was safety, comfort, and home all built from scratch. The hardships of daily cabin life by now. Our mountain man has four sturdy walls, a roof overhead, a door that sort of closes, and a fireplace that smokes just enough to make his eyes water. In short, he's got a cabin. But don't get the wrong idea, life inside wasn't suddenly easy. The wilderness had a way of reminding you that comfort was relative, and cabin life came with its own list of daily hardships. Let's start with the obvious, the cold. Even the best-built cabin leaked drafts. Every tiny gap between logs was like an open invitation for icy wine to sneak in. Sure, you had mud chinking in the cracks, but mud dries, cracks, and falls out. Suddenly, you're sitting by your fire while your toes slowly freeze on the dirt floor. Winter nights could be brutal. Mountain men often slept in every piece of clothing they owned, bundled under blankets made of animal hides. And if the fire went out in the night, good luck. You'd wake up shivering, teeth chattering loud enough to scare off wildlife. Then there was the smoke. Fireplaces were not exactly precision engineered. Some smoked like a chimney should, others puffed back into the cabin, filling the air with a haze that stung your eyes and clung to everything you owned. Picture trying to cook dinner while blinking through smoke like you're in a fog machine at a bad rock concert. After a while, the smell of smoke seeped into your clothes, your bedding, and your beard. You didn't just live with smoke, you wore it. Lighting was another daily struggle. Without glass windows or kerosene lamps, at least in the early days, cabins were dark. Daylight only made it through tiny openings, and at night you relied on the fire or a tallow candle. Candles were smoky, dim, and smelled like burnt meat. Reading after dark was basically impossible unless you enjoyed straining your eyes. Most mountain men went to bed early, not because they were disciplined, but because it was too dark to do anything else. Food was another hurdle. Sure, the cabin gave you shelter, but it didn't put food on the table. Hunting, trapping, and foraging were still daily jobs. Without a steady supply of meat or dried goods, the pantry shelves, if you even had shelves, stayed pretty bare. Meals was simple, stews made from whatever was caught, flatbread cooked over coals, or maybe some dried jerky. And don't forget, food had to be stored carefully. Leave it out, and you'd have rodents or worse sharing dinner with you. Speaking of rodents, Pests were a constant headache. Mice and rats found their way into cabins, nibbling on supplies and running across your bed at night. Insects, too fleas, lice, and mosquitoes thrived, especially in cabins with sod roofs or dirt floors. A man could spend half the evening scratching bites instead of sleeping. Then there were larger intruders. Bears sometimes broke into cabins looking for food. Wolves prowled outside, howling in the night. Even porcupines caused trouble, chewing on wooden tools or gnawing the cabin itself. Cleanliness was another uphill battle. Dirt floors stayed, well, dirty. Even with a broom made from twigs, you couldn't keep the dust and mud out. Add in smoke, grease from cooking, and animal hides drying on the walls, and the cabin wasn't exactly smelling like fresh laundry. Bathing was rare, especially in winter. Most mountain men smelled like wood smoke, sweat, and whatever they'd been cooking that week. Then there was loneliness. Life in a cabin could be incredibly isolating. Some mountain men built near trading posts or neighbors, but many lived miles from the nearest soul. Days could pass without seeing another human. The silence was both peaceful and crushing. You might spend your evenings talking to yourself, or worse, to the cabin walls. A man could grow tough out there, but he could also grow lonely fast. Cabins also required constant maintenance. Roofs leaked, mud chinking crumbled, doors sagged on their rawhide hinges. Keeping everything patched up was a never-ending chore, and winter made it worse. Heavy snow pressed down on roofs, sometimes collapsing them if you hadn't built strong enough beams. Spring thaw brought leaks and mudslides. The cabin wasn't a build it and forget it project. It was a daily relationship, and not always a happy one. Health problems were another hidden danger. A small cut from an axe could turn deadly if it got infected. Smoke inhalation made lungs weak. Poor diet led to scurvy or other illnesses. Without doctors nearby, a mountain man often had to treat himself with herbs, or whatever remedies he remembered from home. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Despite all these hardships, the cabin still felt like a fortress compared to sleeping out in the open. The hardships were part of the trade. A little smoke, a few pests, a stiff back from the cold floor, all for the reward of having your own space in the wild. Every creak of the logs, every crackle of the fire, reminded you that you had carved out survival with your own hands. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't easy. But in those cabins, men endured. They played cards by firelight, cooked simple meals, and told stories to themselves just to hear a human voice. The cabins weren't perfect, but they were proof that life, even rough, smoky, drafty life, was possible in the wild. And maybe, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls, those cabins gave mountain men the greatest comfort of all, the knowledge that they had built something stronger than the wilderness, at least for one more night. Tools of the trade so far. We've watched our mountain man chop trees, notch logs, slap mud into cracks, and somehow not get flattened by a rolling timber. But all of this wasn't done with bare hands, though sometimes it probably felt that way. Out in the wilderness, tools were lifelines. Without the right ones, building a cabin would have been like trying to eat soup with a fork, frustrating, messy, and ultimately impossible. The most important tool, hands down, was the axe. Not just any axe, but a sturdy felling axe sharp enough to bite into wood with every swing. This was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier, used for cutting trees, splitting firewood, shaping logs, and sometimes even serving as a makeshift hammer. A good axe was like a mountain man's best friend. Lose it, and you were in serious trouble. Break the handle, and you'd better know how to carve a new one. Next up was the hatchet. Think of it as the little brother to the axe. While the big axe took down trees, the hatchet handled finer work, shaping notches, trimming branches, or splitting kindling for the fire. It was light enough to carry on your belt, and useful enough that many men kept it close at all times. A mountain man without his hatchet felt as lost as we would today without a phone charger. Then there was the saw. Now, not every mountain man lugged one out into the wild. It depended on where you started and how much weight you could carry. But a crosscut saw was worth its space. Unlike an axe, which chewed its way through a tree with brute force, A saw sliced cleanly and often faster. To men working a long crosscut could drop a tree in far less time than a lone man with an axe. The downside, you had to hold that awkward, sharp-toothed beast around, which wasn't fun on long treks. The adze was another handy tool. If you've never seen one, picture a hoe, but instead of digging dirt, it's designed to shave wood. Mountain men used adzes to flatten logs for floors, shape beams, and smooth rough edges. It wasn't glamorous, but it turned a rough pile of timber into something a little more livable. Without it, your cabin floor might feel more like a collection of trip hazards than a home. Knives were everywhere. A good hunting knife wasn't just for skinning game, it carved pegs, shaved kindling, cut hides, and generally did whatever needed doing. Some men carried smaller carving knives too, for delicate jobs like shaping notches or whittling when boredom set in. A sharp knife could mean the difference between a cabin finished before snowfall and a pile of half-cut logs under snowdrifts. Hammers weren't always the metal kind we think of today. Many mountain men used mallets carved from wood. These were used to drive wooden pegs, pound stakes, or nudge logs into place without splitting them. Metal hammers, if a man had one, were prized, often brought from back east or traded at a post. Chisels also came in handy. Notching logs required precision, and while an axe could do the rough work, a chisel cleaned up the cuts. With a good mallet and chisel, the corners of your cabin fit tighter, meaning fewer drafts whistling through at night. No chisel. You just had to hope your axe skills were good enough to make do. Rope was another essential. Not technically a tool, but try dragging a log without it. Rope hauled timbers, tied down roof poles, and sometimes even served as makeshift hinges. Mountain men often made their own from rawhide or plant fibers when store-bought rope ran out. Durable rope was worth its weight in gold. Then there was the auger. This was basically a hand drill with a corkscrew bit, used to bore holes in logs for wooden pegs. Pegs were crucial for holding the cabin together when nails were scarce, which was almost always. Nails were heavy, expensive, and hard to come by in the wilderness. Wooden pegs, though, free, as long as you had trees and an auger. Let's not forget the shovel. Whether you were digging a root cellar, leveling ground for the cabin, or scooping mud for chinking, a shovel was indispensable. A strong back helped, too, but without a shovel, you'd be reduced to clawing at the dirt with your hands. Not very efficient. Of course, tools didn't last forever. Handles broke, blades dulled, teeth on saws bent out of shape. A smart mountain man carried sharpening stones and knew how to repair what he had. Sometimes that meant carving a new handle for an axe or hammer, sometimes regrinding a blade until it was thin as paper. Tools were investments, and taking care of them was as important as taking care of yourself. Not every man had a full set of tools. Some showed up with nothing more than an axe, a knife, and determination. Others, especially those who traveled west in wagons, carried whole chests of gear. But regardless of how much or how little you had, you made do. A creative mountain man could turn a handful of tools into a cabin, a smokehouse, and a whole life carved out of the wilderness. And sometimes, even with tools, it came down to improvisation. No hammer, use a rock. No saw, double down on axe swings. No shovel, grab a stick and dig like you mean it. Life on the frontier wasn't about having everything. It was about using whatever you had until it worked. At the end of the day, tools were the bridge between survival and despair. They were the difference between a cabin that kept you warm all winter and a pile of logs that never fit together. Every nicked axe blade and worn-down knife told a story of hours spent fighting the land and winning, one swing at a time. So yes, mountain men relied on grit, muscle, and stubbornness. But without their tools, all the grit in the world wouldn't have stacked those logs into 4 walls. Tools didn't just build cabins, they built survival itself. Furnishing the cabin by now. Our mountain man has a roof, walls, a door that kind of works, and a fireplace that smokes just enough to remind him he's alive. But here is the thing, a cabin without furniture is basically just a drafty wooden cave. You can't sit on the firewood pile forever. and sleeping on the floor quickly loses its charm. That's where furnishing the cabin came in, not with fancy couches and dining sets, but with whatever you could cobble together from logs, branches, and sheer determination. The first piece of furniture most mountain men made was a bed. Sleeping on a dirt floor wasn't ideal. Cold crept up from the ground, and you'd wake up stiff as a frozen mule. So beds were often simple raised platforms. The frame was built from logs or poles lashed together, then topped with a layer of pine boughs, straw, or animal hides. Soft? Not really. But compared to bare ground, it felt like luxury. Some men added ropes strung between the frame to make a kind of frontier hammock, which sagged in the middle but kept you off the cold earth. Next came a table. Even the roughest cabins usually had one, built from split logs or flat boards, hacked out with an adze. Tables weren't for feasts, they were workbenches, dining spots, and sometimes even butchering stations. Legs were often uneven, so the table wobbled like a drunk mule, but a few shims of bark fixed it well enough. A good, sturdy table was the heart of the cabin, the place where meals were eaten, tools were mended, and maps were spread out in the flickering firelight. Chairs, on the other hand, were a luxury. Many mountain men settled for stools, basically a log cut flat on one side. Quick, simple, and functional. If you wanted something fancier, you carved 3 legs, added a board for the seat, and hoped it didn't tip over when you sat down. Some cabins had benches instead, long planks supported by logs, perfect for seating a group or for doubling as a shelf when no guests were around, which was most of the time. Speaking of shelves, storage was another big deal. A cabin wasn't big, so every inch of space mattered. Men carved pegs right into the walls to hang coats, tools, and rifles. Shelves made from split boards held tin cups, cooking pots, and maybe a precious book or two. If you didn't make storage, everything ended up in a pile on the floor, and tripping over an axe in the middle of the night was not fun. Lighting was handled with lamps and candles, but even those needed a place to sit. Some cabins had little niches cut into the wall logs where a candle could be wedged. Others had wooden stands or shelves near the fireplace. A good candle holder was worth making, if only to avoid burning the cabin down every time you tried to see after sunset. Now, let's talk about luxury items. Some men built rocking chairs. Yes, seriously. After a long day of hauling logs or chasing elk, sitting in a rocking chair by the fire must have felt heavenly. Others carved decorative touches, simple patterns on furniture, or maybe a personal symbol carved above the door. Cabin life was rough, but mountain men still wanted a little beauty in their homes. And then there was storage for food. A root cellar was ideal, dug right into the earth beside the cabin, but not every man had the time or energy for that. Inside the cabin, food was often stored in wooden boxes, barrels, or sacks hung from the rafters to keep mice out. Hanging food from the ceiling beams was common, though you had to watch out for bears catching a whiff from outside. Beds, tables, stools, shelves, these were the essentials, but cabins sometimes had other touches too. A rifle rack by the door, so your weapon was always within arm's reach. A rough dresser or chest for clothes, usually just a wooden box. Maybe even a bench by the fire, perfect for warming your feet after a day in the snow. None of it came from a store, it was all hacked, carved, and hammered into shape by hand. The thing about furnishing a cabin was that it never really ended. Mountain men added pieces over time, as they had the energy or need. Maybe you built a stool one winter, a better bed the next, and finally got around to shelves 3 years later. A cabin was always evolving, shaped by its owner's skill, patience, and free time. And sure, the furniture was rough. A leg might wobble, a shelf might lean, and a stool might crack if you sat down too hard. But it was yours. Every peg, every plank, every lopsided corner was proof you'd built it with your own hands. That sense of ownership made even the simplest log bench feel priceless. So when you imagine a mountain man in his cabin, don't picture empty walls and a pile of hides. Picture a rough-hewn bed tucked in a corner, a wobbling table by the fire, stools scattered around, and shelves lined with tools, tin cups, and whatever little treasures he owned. It wasn't fancy, but it was functional. And in the wild, functional often meant the difference between misery and comfort. At the end of a long day, a mountain man could sit on his stool, rest his boots on the hearth, and feel, if only for a moment, that his little cabin was not just shelter, but home. Community in cabin raising. When you think of mountain men, you probably picture a scruffy loner with a beard down to his chest, living in a cabin that barely holds together. And yes, many of them were loners, surviving by grit and stubbornness. But here is the thing, even the toughest mountain man sometimes needed a little help. Building a cabin wasn't always a one-man job, and when other folks were around, cabin raising could turn into a full-on community event. Now, let's be clear, not every man had neighbors close enough to call on. Some cabins were miles from the nearest smoke trail, and you might go weeks without seeing another human face. But in places where settlers gathered, valleys, river crossings, or near trading posts, helping each other build cabins was common. It was practical, and it was also a good excuse to get together, swap stories, and maybe even share a jug of homemade whiskey. The idea was simple. One man alone could take weeks to build 4 walls and a roof, but with a dozen helping hands, you could raise a cabin in a single day. Everyone pitched in, chopping, hauling, stacking, and notching. It was hard work, but with so many people, it became a kind of frontier party. Picture it, early morning, the men gather with axes and saws, ropes and muscle. The site is cleared, logs are already cut, and everyone knows their job. Some roll the logs into place, others notch them, while the strongest men heave them onto the growing walls. Voices shout back and forth, laughter mixes with grunts of effort, and little by little, a cabin starts to rise where only open ground stood the day before. Women and children often joined too. While men wrangled logs, women cooked meals to feed the workers, big pots of stew, cornbread, maybe even pies if supplies allowed. Children hauled water, gathered kindling, or just ran around underfoot, getting in the way. By midday, the smell of food drew everyone to a long, rough hewn table or a spread of blankets, and they ate together before getting back to work. The most dramatic moment was raising the heavy logs for the roof. This required coordination and trust. With ropes and sheer strength, the logs were hauled up, slid into place, and secured. One wrong move, and someone could end up flattened. But with experience and teamwork, the job got done. Once the roof was on, everyone let out a cheer, because a cabin with a roof was well on its way to becoming a home. Cabin raisings weren't just about the building, they were about community bonds. Out in the wilderness, you couldn't afford to be entirely alone. A neighbor who helped you stack logs in the summer might be the same one to lend food in a harsh winter or come running if danger struck. Working together built more than cabins, it built trust, friendships, and sometimes lifelong alliances. And of course, once the hard work was finished, there was usually some kind of celebration. Frontier folks weren't about to pass up an excuse for music, dancing, or passing around a jug. A fiddle might appear, boots would stomp on the packed turf, and laughter carried into the night. The cabin, rough as it was, became the centerpiece of a gathering, proof that together, people could carve something solid out of the wilderness. It wasn't always smooth sailing, though. With so many strong personalities in one place, arguments happened. Maybe one man thought the logs should be stacked tighter, or another accused someone of cutting corners. Sometimes tempers flared, but usually the bigger goal, getting the cabin built, kept everyone focused. After all, nobody wanted to be the reason a neighbor had to spend winter in a half-finished shack. Even when mountain men built alone, the spirit of cabin raising lingered. They'd seen how quickly a group could work, and they carried that memory with them. Solitary builders sometimes dreamed of the day they'd settle in a valley with neighbors close enough to lend a hand. In the grand scheme of frontier life, cabin raising was more than construction. It was survival, cooperation, and celebration rolled into one. A cabin built by many hands stood as a symbol not just of shelter, but of community. Out in the wild, where dangers loomed and loneliness pressed in, those bombs mattered just as much as the walls themselves. So next time you picture a mountain man in his cabin, don't just imagine the lonely figure. Picture the day it was raised friends and strangers hauling logs, stew bubbling in a pot, fiddles playing by firelight, and laughter echoing through the trees. For one day, the wilderness didn't feel so wild. It felt like home. Dangers of the wilderness, building a cabin in the mountains, was tough enough, but living in one came with a whole set of dangers. The wilderness didn't care how hard you'd worked on your 4 log walls. It had its own rules, and mountain men had to learn fast or pay the price. First up, wild animals. The mountains weren't empty, they were home to bears, wolves, cougars, and all sorts of critters that didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. Imagine stepping outside to fetch water and finding a grizzly sniffing around your fire pit. Not ideal. Bears were the scariest neighbors. They could tear open a food cache in minutes and weren't shy about wandering into camp. Some men lost entire winter supplies in one unlucky night. The solution: store food high up in trees, hang it from rafters, or build stout boxes. Even then, a determined bear could cause trouble. Wolves got a bad reputation, but they usually stayed away from humans. Still, a hungry pack in winter might circle a cabin, their howls echoing through the night. It was enough to make even the toughest mountain man pull the covers up to his chin. Cougars were stealthy, rarely seen, but always felt. If one decided to stalk you, you probably wouldn't know until it was too late. Frontier life kept you constantly alert. Then there were the small pests: mice, rats, mosquitoes, and fleas. A single crack in the wall could become a highway for rodents, who helped themselves to your dried meat or gnawed through your gear. Mosquitoes turned summer nights into itchy nightmares, while fleas and lice thrived in cabins that were, let's just say, less than spotless. Sometimes, the little enemies were more exhausting than the big ones. Weather was another relentless danger. The mountains didn't play around. Winters could trap a man indoors for weeks, snow piled against the door, wind howling through every chink in the logs. If you hadn't chopped enough wood or stored enough food, you were in real trouble. Summer brought storms that could flatten trees, lightning strikes that set forests ablaze, and floods that swept away cabins built too close to rivers. Nature's message was clear: respect it or suffer. Accidents were common too. Swinging an axe all day was risky business. One slip, and you could lose a toe, or worse. Cuts got infected fast in a world without doctors nearby. Burns from the fireplace, falls from roofs, sprains, broken bones, all were part of the frontier gamble. Something as small as a splinter could turn deadly if it festered. That's why mountain men had to learn a little medicine, patching themselves up with herbs, poultices, and stubborn willpower. Then there was isolation. Dangers weren't always physical, sometimes they were in your head. Imagine weeks of silence, the only sound your own axe echoing through the trees. Loneliness could weigh heavy. Some men thrived in solitude, but others cracked under it. A cabin could feel like a safe haven, or it could feel like a prison, depending on the season and your state of mind. Encounters with other people could be dangerous too. Relations with native tribes varied, sometimes friendly trade, sometimes deadly conflict. Misunderstandings, trespasses, or just bad luck could turn an ordinary day into a fight for survival. Then there were other mountain men. Most were decent enough, but every so often you ran into someone desperate, or just mean. A rifle over the mantle wasn't just for hunting, it was also insurance against unwelcome visitors. And we can't forget hunger. Even with hunting and trapping, food could run scarce. A bad winter might mean snares stayed empty and animals vanished into the deep woods. Trapping routes could fail, rivers could freeze over, and suddenly you were rationing every crumb of jerky. Starvation wasn't a distant threat, it was a real possibility if you miscalculated your supplies. Despite all these dangers, mountain men endured. They built cabins in places most folks wouldn't dare camp for a single night. They faced bears, storms, sickness, and solitude with grit and, sometimes, a dash of humor. When you think about it, those little log cabins weren't just homes, they were shields against a wilderness that was always testing them. So next time you feel brave for shooing a raccoon out of your garbage, just remember, mountain men dealt with grizzlies at the door, wolves at the tree line, and frost creeping through the walls. And somehow, they managed to laugh, keep going, and build a life out there. That's not just survival, that's stubborn courage. Legends and tall tales now. If there's one thing mountain men liked almost as much as hunting or building cabins, it was telling stories. After all, nights in the wilderness were long, cold, and quiet. You could only sharpen your knife so many times or stare at the fire before your mind started to wander. That's when the tall tales came out. Some stories were true or at least partly true. Others, well, let's just say, they got a little creative in the retelling. Around a campfire, or inside a smoky cabin with stew bubbling in the pot, mountain men spun yarns big enough to stretch across the Rockies. Take the classic bear stories. Every mountain man, it seemed, had wrestled a grizzly at some point. In these tales, the bear was always twice the size of any real bear, and the fight lasted hours, ending with the man walking away with nothing but a scratch. Reality check. In most actual encounters, smart men avoided bears altogether. But where's the fun in telling your buddies you ran away? Much better to say you traded blows with a beast the size of a wagon. There were also river stories, rapids, whirlpools, and near drownings. Men bragged about crossing raging torrents with nothing but a log to cling to, or paddling canoes through white water so wild it would scare the fish. Did some of these things happen? Sure, but the way they told it, you'd think they were half man, half salmon. And then there were the legendary figures, part real, part myth. Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, Hugh Glass. You might have heard of Glass from that story where he got mauled by a bear, left 4 dead, and crawled hundreds of miles to safety. That tale grew bigger every time it was told, until he sounded less like a man and more like a frontier superhero. Mountain men love stories like that because they blurred the line between reality and legend and gave everyone a hero to look up to or compete with. Tall tales weren't just about danger, though. Humor played a big role. A man might brag about the enormous trout he caught, so big I had to wrestle it onto shore like a wild horse, or about a moose that charged him but slipped in the mud and broke its own antlers. The wilder the exaggeration, the better the laughs around the fire. These stories weren't meant to be fact-checked, they were meant to entertain. Sometimes the stories carried lessons, too. A tale about getting lost in the mountains might be exaggerated, but at its core was a warning: don't wander too far without a compass, or at least a good sense of direction. A funny story about burning dinner in the fire might remind younger trappers to pay attention while cooking. In a world without books or schools nearby, storytelling was one way knowledge got passed along. Of course, not all stories were shared. Some were whispered strange noises in the woods, lights on the horizon, things that couldn't be explained. Call them ghost stories, call them frontier superstitions, but every community had them. Sitting in a dark cabin, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks, it didn't take much imagination to believe in spirits or monsters lurking just beyond the firelight. Tall tales gave mountain men something more than just entertainment. They gave them identity. To be part of that world, you had to have a story, even if it was stretched a bit. It was a way of saying, I belong here. I've faced the world, and I've got the scars or at least the words to prove it. And the best part, these stories didn't stay in the mountains. They traveled east, carried by traders and visitors, growing with each retelling. By the time they reached city folk, mountain men were larger than life, half wild, half legend, and all adventure. In some ways, the tall tales shaped how the rest of the country saw the frontier, more than the reality ever did. So when you think of a mountain man by his fire, don't just picture him sharpening a knife or patching a moccasin. Picture him leaning forward, eyes glowing in the firelight, spinning a yarn so wild you can't help but believe it, at least for a moment. Whether he actually wrestled that bear or caught that fish the size of a canoe doesn't matter. What matters is the story, and how it carried him and everyone listening through another long night in the wilderness. In the end, mountain men didn't just build cabins and trap beavers. They built legends, and those legends are still around today, bigger, bolder, and maybe just a little taller with every retelling. The end of the mountain man era. Every story has an ending, even the wild, untamed saga of the mountain men. For decades, they roamed the high country, trapping, trading, and carving out cabins from scratch. But by the mid-1800s, their way of life was fading fast. The world was changing, and no matter how stubborn a man was, you couldn't fight history forever. The main reason for the decline was simple: beavers, or rather, the lack of them. Beaver pelts had fueled the fur trade, turning mountain men into rugged businessmen in buckskins. But fashion is a fickle beast. Back east, gentlemen decided tall beaver hats weren't stylish anymore. Silk hats became the rage, and almost overnight, demand for beaver pelts collapsed. Trappers who once hauled piles of skins to trading posts suddenly found themselves with goods nobody wanted. No pelts, no profit. At the same time, overtrapping had taken its toll. Streams and valleys that once teemed with beavers grew quiet. Even if hats had stayed in fashion, there just weren't enough animals left in some areas to support the old lifestyle. Mountain men were victims of their own success, in a way too good at catching beavers for their own future. Then came the settlers. Wagon trains rolled west, bringing farmers, families, and fences. Where a mountain man once had valleys all to himself, now there were plows turning the soil and cabins sprouting everywhere. The wilderness shrank, and the freedom to roam shrank with it. For men who loved solitude and wide open spaces, this was a slow kind of suffocation. Trading posts also gave way to towns. The old barter system, beaver pelts for flour, bullets, or whiskey, shifted into a cash economy. Mountain men, who had thrived on independence, suddenly found themselves outsiders in a world of stores, banks, and laws. Their rough edges didn't fit well in a society that wanted order and stability. Some adapted. A few became guides for wagon trains, leading settlers through the mountains they knew like the backs of their weathered hands. Others hired on as scouts for the military, mapping routes and warning of dangers. A handful even settled down, building permanent homes, marrying, and farming. But many simply faded into obscurity, their names remembered only in the tall tales told around campfires. The 1840s and 50s marked the true twilight. By then, the rendezvous, the great annual gatherings, where mountain men met to trade, party, and swap stories, had mostly ended. Without pelts to trade, the gatherings lost their purpose. What had once been the highlight of the year became a memory. And yet, even as their real numbers dwindled, the legend of the mountain man grew. Newspapers, dime novels, and traveling shows painted them as fearless adventurers, battling nature and living wild and free. The truth was grittier, lonelier, and often harsher. But legends don't worry about cold nights, broken tools, or empty traps. Legends live on because they inspire. Today, when we think of mountain men, we see them in buckskins, rifle in hand, standing tall against a backdrop of towering peaks. We imagine them building cabins from scratch, wrestling bears, and living off the land with nothing but grit and an axe. That image might not be 100% accurate, but it captures something real. They were survivors, builders, storytellers, and dreamers. They carved lives where most people would have seen only wilderness. Their cabins, many long gone, were more than just logs stacked together. They were symbols of resilience, proof that with a few tools, a strong back, and maybe a little luck, you could claim a corner of the mountains and call it home. The mountain man era ended, but its spirit lingers. You can see it in the stories still told, in the reenactments at frontier festivals, and in the fascination people feel for that rugged independence. The cabins may have rotted away, the traps long rusted, but the idea that a person can face the world and make something out of nothing still fires the imagination. So, as we close this chapter, picture it. The last of the mountain men, sitting by the fire in his cabin, looking out at the land he once roamed freely. Maybe he feels the end coming, maybe he doesn't, but for that moment, in the glow of the fire and the creak of the log walls, He knows he lived life on his own terms. And really, that's all a mountain man ever wanted.